Russian President Vladimir Putin has come out in a general support of a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, a move which the US President Donald Trump has described as promising. Mr. Putin made the comments during a media conference earlier this morning ahead of a planned meeting with US officials that came a day after he visited the heavily contested Kursk region where Russian troops have made major advances. However, he qualified his support for the ceasefire by saying questions still remain about how it would work in reality.
In these conditions, I believe it would be good for the Ukrainian side to achieve at least a 30-day ceasefire, and we are in favor of it. But there are nuances. What are they? First of all, what are we going to do about this incursion in Kursk region? If we ceased hostilities for 30 days, what would that mean? Would that allow Ukraine to continue a forced mobilization, a supply of arms to Ukraine, so that the newly mobilized units can be trained? Or will that not be done? And who will give orders to cease hostilities? And what will these orders be worth?
That was Vladimir Putin speaking through a translator. Vladimir Putin says he may hold a phone conversation with US President Donald Trump to iron out some of those details. Mr. Trump spoke to media a short time ago and says the fighting needs to stop.
We'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia. And we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire. A lot of the individual subjects have been discussed, though. We've been discussing concepts of land because you don't want to waste time with a ceasefire if it's not going to mean anything. So we're saying, look, this is what you can get, this is what you can't get. They discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what the answer to that is. They've known that answer for 40 years, in all fairness. So a lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
Well, Donald Trump's comments come after he met with the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, at the White House. So that happened in just the last few hours. Our US correspondent, Simon Marks, has been watching all of this unfold from Washington, D.C. and joins us now. Kia ora, good morning, Simon. What do you make of Vladimir Putin's this morning? I mean, Trump saying it was promising, but Mr. Putin wanting clarity on logistics, essentially, and what he's called the removing the underlying causes of the crisis. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think this was Vladimir Putin, as expected, being pretty wily and canny about this proposed ceasefire that the United States wants him to sign on to. I mean, he's essentially saying he loves the idea of a ceasefire. He's just not sure he likes this particular ceasefire. And in order to make it more to his liking, he's got huge demands that he's made of Ukraine. He says Russia wants guarantees that Ukraine will not mobilize its troops, even train its troops during the course of that 30-day pause. He also wants guarantees that Ukraine won't receive any weapons shipments from the United States, from Europe, from anywhere else during the course of that 30-day ceasefire. He argues that otherwise the ceasefire would simply give Ukraine an opportunity to regroup militarily at a time when, thanks to Donald Trump, Russian forces have been on the advance. That's as a direct consequence of President Trump's decision last week to suspend arms shipments to Ukraine and to freeze intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Two actions that have now been lifted, but there's no question that they had consequences for Ukrainian forces, negative consequences on the battlefield. It's also not clear whether Vladimir Putin is saying that Russian forces would agree not to mobilize or to train during the course of that ceasefire, and whether Russia would also stop accepting any military shipments, whether they're coming from Iran or anywhere else during the course of that pause. So the devil of this was always going to be in the details. I think what was most surprising about what we heard from President Trump in the Oval Office as he sat alongside the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte there was this idea that the Americans have already been negotiating land and negotiating the future of the Zaporizhia power plant, it seems, with their Ukrainian interlocutors, which will only underscore the view of many observers here that President Trump from the get-go has been tilting the outcome of these negotiations in Russia's favour. But what is he going to do now if Russia says this particular ceasefire in its current form, we don't really like the look of it?
Mr. Putin said he wants to iron out some of these details with Donald Trump, despite what you're saying about a lot of it already having been discussed. So Trump's special envoy arriving in Moscow now. What do we know about that meeting? Is there any chance that if Russia doesn't play this right, that they feel the wrath of the Trump administration, or you think that's unlikely?
Well, it's definitely possible. I mean, Donald Trump said on Friday, and he's repeated several times this week, that he is seriously contemplating the imposition of fresh American sanctions on Russia. There are those here who think that he should already have done that, given the bombardment of Ukraine that took place over the weekend, even as those conversations in Riyadh, in Jeddah rather, between the United States and the Ukrainian delegation were just shaping up. And the whole concept of this 30-day ceasefire was first being floated. This meeting at the Kremlin that's going to be taking place between Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin is now definitely going to be hugely important. It is perfectly possible that Vladimir Putin will also hold out for a direct conversation with President Trump, and the American leader indicated he would be open to that. Remember that Steve Witkoff is not a seasoned, experienced diplomat. He's a real estate man. He's Donald Trump's golfing buddy. They've been friends for over 40 years. Now, he has some standing with the Kremlin because he did negotiate the return to the United States of a jailed American, Mark Fogel, who was being held on after a drugs conviction in Russia. That was just a few weeks back. So the Kremlin has clearly decided Steve Witkoff is the American connected to Trump that they can work with, but equally foreign policy veterans here in Washington find it curious that Secretary of State Marco Rubio isn't part of the delegation that will be arriving at the Kremlin for those talks. Neither is National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. They're the people that have spoken to the Ukrainians, and yet it's falling to Steve Witkoff, who wasn't in the room with the Ukrainians, now to go and talk to Vladimir Putin and see whether he can bring him across the line.
Just very briefly, time is against us, but the NATO chief has been meeting with Trump, as we mentioned. We've seen that familiar scene now of the all the press in the Oval Office while the two men were sitting side by side. How did that meeting go? Did we get a vibe out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the press, and I think it's important to underscore, several pro-Trump propagandists, part of the White House pool today, throwing softballs at Donald Trump, including one question about whether he had any plans to annex Greenland. And President Trump indicated that he wants NATO's help in taking control of Greenland's territory. Mark Rutte, I think, like so many others who have sat in that chair in the Oval Office over the last couple of weeks, is trying to walk a very careful line. I mean, he was very appreciative of everything that Donald Trump has done to bring about the possibility of peace in Ukraine, and he was bending over backwards to do nothing but sound supportive of the American president. But they've then headed off into a private lunch, and we'll see what comes out of that.
Thank you very much, as always. That's our US correspondent Simon Marks there. Now, the New Zealand government says New Zealand is not among a group of 15 countries that have committed to join what's been called the Coalition of the Willing on Ukraine. Following a meeting of military officials in Paris, Defence Minister Judith Collins told RNZ in a statement that New Zealand hadn't been asked to join security guarantees at this point. She said New Zealand Defence is participating in discussions about possible post-conflict support for Ukraine.